The report really is primarily directed at government as the audience. So it identifies a number of opportunities for government-led, but on the flip side of that, there are also a number of opportunities through there in terms of recommendations that can be taken on board by the sector as well in terms of engaging with government and the mechanisms to successfully engage and to drive further collaboration between the sector moving forward. So in terms of an overview, the intent of the report was really to look at fairly broadly at opportunities for collaboration between government and the sector to drive supply of housing. And the report was informed through a fairly comprehensive analysis process. So we met with and discussed with representatives both from government and the community housing sector within WA, and also with advocacy industry groups. So that was around really getting a range of viewpoints around current practice and what the opportunities might be in terms of collaboration going forward. In terms of the report, the initial intent was really to look at project structures and delivery mechanisms that could be used to further collaboration between government and the sector. However, what came out quite strongly through the discussions and particularly through the consultation was issues around relationships and working practices between government and the sector, and that those are constraining collaboration and constraining the opportunity in terms of further collaboration or exploring different project structures as well. So a number of the recommendations of the report focus on those more relationship and working type findings, as well as recommendations that then move into appropriate financing and project delivery structures as well that can be utilised moving forward. The premise of the report really is based around the idea that government and the sector, by working in partnership, can bring benefit. And so really what the report is built around is this notion that there is benefit through collaboration, and that's because of both financial and more broader social and qualitative outcomes as well. So the first piece around that is really the ability of the community housing sector to deliver better value for money in terms of delivery of social and affordable housing. And so government, by working in collaboration and working in partnership models, can actually achieve housing outcomes at a lower cost than through traditional models of government funding and operation of housing. The reason for that is because of a number of advantages that the sector has, primarily around using the charitable status of participants in the sector, and that providing tax concessions, including GST concessions, that reduce the cost of actually delivering and maintaining housing. There's also opportunity when community housing providers are involved for them to leverage government funding with funding from other sources. And the primary opportunity there is around accessing finance through the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation. And that's an avenue of financing that isn't available to government and allows CHPs to leverage and build on government funding in project opportunities. The final piece in terms of that financial benefit is really around the ability for the sector and community housing providers to access operational funding from Commonwealth, primarily through tenants being eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance. And again, that's an advantage that's unique to the sector that government, state government is not able to access. And so what that means is that by bringing those pieces together, there are opportunities for financial benefit when government looks to collaborate with the sector on delivery and management of social and affordable housing. More so, and building on those financial benefits, there are also a number of other benefits for government in partnering with CHPs, and primarily that's around tenant outcomes. And what we've seen is, particularly based on some tenant and participant surveys, improved tenant outcomes where CHPs are managing housing as opposed to government managing housing, and increased tendency for CHPs to offer additional wraparound services as well as just the provision of housing. Now, as Michelle flagged earlier, there's also a number of CHPs that provide bespoke support services. So, for example, specialist disability accommodation providers or CHPs that are focused around target cohorts and consequently can achieve really specific outcomes for those cohorts as well. And so that drives that broader outcome as well. Then in terms of ability to drive supply, we see is that where CHPs are involved, firstly that they can reinvest profits or revenues achieved from housing are typically reinvested to deliver more supply or to renew supply. And that in terms of actually delivering housing stock, there tends to be a greater focus where CHPs are involved around environmental sustainability, designing for improved maintenance and operational cost outcomes, because there is really a long-term focus in terms of the delivery of housing. The final piece in terms of benefit that we see is that a number of CHPs now, particularly those that operate nationally, are able to access learnings and expertise from counterparts in other jurisdictions. There's also significant collaboration within the sector, led by groups like Shelter and Cheer and Power Housing, that mean that there is cross-pollination, the sharing of ideas and programs that mean that outcomes are improved, and that those benefits that are achieved are then passed on and able to be built on by CHPs moving forward. So premised on that, really, we see is there is a number of benefits financially and from more of a broader tenant and social outcome because of partnership between, or that can arise through partnership between government and CHPs. And consequently, the report then builds on or looks into how can that collaboration be enhanced and how can we make sure that those benefits are being realised. It's useful to consider what the WA community housing sector looks like in terms of its collective ability to partner with government. The sector has 266 organisations operating within the state. A number of those are currently registered CHPs, so registered through the national regulator, and then a number of unregistered organisations, including sort of smaller not-for-profits and a number of local governments that provide community housing as well. So across the sector, managing about 22% of the state's social housing, so a significant volume in terms of number of houses or asset value as well. Notwithstanding that, and that it's a size of sector that is consistent with what we see in other states around Australia relative to the population and the volume of housing within WA. But notwithstanding that, there is greater opportunity or potential opportunity for further development of the WA CHP sector. And a lot of that can come through government support and capacity building, both through project opportunities and more targeted sector development and capacity building opportunities as well. The other lever that can be used to grow the sector is, and as we'll touch on in the recommendations a bit later, where there is government policy or there are constraints placed on CHPs in terms of their ability to operate current housing and deliver more housing through government policy and government settings. Addressing those is another key mechanism in terms of being able to grow the sector more broadly and help both government and the sector collaboratively work towards addressing significant shortfall in terms of volume of social housing that's available. So in terms of the report identifies a number of models from sort of a structural delivery and operating model point of view that could be used in a collaborative approach between government and the sector. And it looks at a full spectrum all the way through from sort of cash support, whether it's in subsidy or grants, through to some more sophisticated and innovative structures, including sort of PPP and joint venture structures that can be utilised. The report, and once you get to have a look at it, does work through a qualitative assessment that considers ability of those models to be rolled out in WA and the likely palatability both for government and the CHP sector as well. And based on that qualitative assessment, identifies that the most effective models to be utilised really is firstly a fairly simple grant funding model. And then more progressively, one of the key things that comes out is the ability of government to use land as a key component within models. So whether that's provision of freehold land or more through a leasehold model, as we've seen with the Smith Street development that government's taken out to market. And as I'd note, or would note here, while the report works through these models and sort of lands at those as the most effective ones, it's been interesting to see that over sort of the last 6 to 12 months, which has been the period that the funding and the proposal for this report and the conduct of the research for the report has taken shape, that's been the direction that government's headed through most recently the SHRP, so Social Housing and Economic Recovery Program, grant funding program, and then through land provision with that Smith Street development, and then also with of the flagged housing diversity pipeline that is moving forward as well. So interesting to see government moving in that direction, and certainly aligned with what the report's saying, but we see that there is more opportunity to build on that and to take learnings from those lessons and use those, or from those programs, and learn the lessons and use them moving forward as well. Within the report, it then considers, as well as qualitatively which models are most beneficial, runs through a financial modelling exercise to demonstrate the potential benefit to government in terms of how various models can be used to deliver a saving to government. And so what the modelling does is takes a fairly generic, noting that there is no such thing as kind of a standard CHP project or government social housing project, but looking at a fairly generic set of assumptions and inputs in terms of a size and nature of development. And comparing basically the cost for government to deliver housing, social housing under a typical purchase land and provide the funding for the housing and then government ownership model. Comparing that back to a number of different structures, and primarily the ground lease structure, where housing is then provided on sort of a build-to-rent basis over a lease term. And the key piece there is that looking at that far right-hand column, under each model, there will be some subsidy required from government to a CHP, given the economics associated with social housing. But what we see is that when we start to bring mixed tenure developments, so a combination of social and affordable housing, and under those ground lease structures, the cost of government providing housing is lowered. So rather than having to bear the full cost, we see that cost dropping down from $625,000, which is a kind of notional cost of construction and land. The ability to save sort of $150,000 under a leasehold model, and then that saving to grow when models that involve market housing as well come into the mix there. And there is a balance between the volume of housing that's provided and the cost of providing housing. And so that's where there is always a choice, or sort of a balance between project economics and volume of housing and social outcomes that are achieved. But certainly under that second model there, where there's a mix of social and affordable housing under a leasehold model, it's clear that there is still a significant saving achievable by government, and consequently potential benefit from both sides in terms of both government and a CHP in pursuing these sorts of structures from both a qualitative outcome as well as a financial perspective as well. So premised on building on that, the notion that there is benefit from a financial and a social and qualitative benefits outcome perspective, the report then brings in a number of recommendations, both around, as I touched on earlier, sort of more relationship-based points, as well as models and structures that can be utilised by government. And the first of those is remarkably simple, but a point that really would underpin a number of the other pieces within the recommendations, and that is to the specific recommendation is around reinstating roundtable discussions between CHPs and various levels of government. But more broadly, the theme underneath this recommendation is increased communication and flow of information, both from government to CHPs, but also the other way as well in terms of the sector engaging with government. And that's about having a common understanding around constraints and opportunities, and particularly communication around what opportunities may be in the pipeline. So a key theme that came through the consultation was, while government's done some good things in terms of programs, grant programs, and different project structures, it'd be great for the sector to have more visibility around what's coming and an understanding of, sort of what's in the pipeline, so that they're positioned and able to respond and able to get best value for government by being in a position to respond to those kind of opportunities. So the first recommendation there is to bring back the Housing Advisory Roundtable, which was a previous program of meetings between the sector and government, and more broadly to expand that to increase communication between government and the sector to drive that collaboration. Recommendation 2 touches on, as I mentioned before, there are constraints in the way that government policy impacts on community housing providers at the moment, and one of those is the Community Housing Agreement, which is associated with properties that have been transferred from government to CHPs previously. That is proving to be a constraint on the sector's ability to deliver more housing, and that's primarily around the requirement for CHPs to seek permission from government for projects, even where it's not specifically requesting government funding or putting government housing at risk. And so we see that by restructuring that agreement and removing some of those policy constraints, it provides more freedom to CHPs to actually seek their own project opportunities and drive housing supply of their own volition. There are also a number of operational policies, things like income eligibility and rent setting for social housing, which either are outdated policies or policies kind of under review, which are contributing to a lack of flexibility in the way that CHPs sort of use those policies as part of their operations. And what we see is that there would be benefit in review of those policies, but for that review to be done in partnership. And so one where the sector, by actively engaging with government and providing input into those policies in that review process, would be able to achieve better outcomes than a sort of an isolated government review. So it's one where we see sort of the benefit of advocacy involvement from the sector as well in terms of driving a government position on those policies. The third recommendation is fairly similar, and again, it's around an existing government policy or existing position, which is head leases between government and CHPs, where what were previously government properties have been transferred under lease for management by community housing providers. That since about 2016, that has been a periodic lease because there's been a need to re-engage between communities and the sector to update that draft lease, but that hasn't been able to be resolved over that period of time, which I think reflects that earlier recommendation around the importance of communication and collaboration. The practical impact of that is that CHPs that have properties under head lease aren't able to borrow against those assets or leverage from those assets because of the periodic nature of those leases and the ability to then finance against those leases. So again, it's a recommendation. It's really a government requirement or a government-led process in terms of resolving those issues, but one where the sector, through engaging actively, can assist in achieving the best outcomes from that process. Recommendation 4 then moves into the more programmatic or the right delivery models for housing. And interestingly, it was feedback both from the sector and from government as well across communities, Treasury and other elements of government that they see significant benefit around grant programs to not only to deliver housing, but also through that to build sector capacity and to leverage some of those benefits of CHP delivery as opposed to government delivery. What we see is that grant programs, they're great in their ability to actually deliver more bang for buck than just the dollars which are provided through the grants. So the ability to bring in other funding sources, particularly to use project opportunities that CHP may have, and a grant providing a top up to deliver the financial feasibility for that project as opposed to being the sole source of funding. And so consequently, significant benefits seen in grants, and probably the key part of this recommendation is the ability to have more of a rolling pipeline of grants as opposed to the large lumpy structure of grants that we've seen previously coming out for government. And that's where sort of the establishment of an investment fund that would allow periodic release of grants or access to grant funding on a kind of as needs basis from the sector would be more beneficial than the lumpy time limited structure at the moment that CHPs have less flexibility in terms of the ability to bring their own proposals because they need to align timing with when government is releasing funding. So the recommendation there is really around a continued focus on grant programs, but also a more rolling program so that they can be accessed by CHPs as required and when there can be the best benefit achieved from those grants. Recommendation 5 then, building on what's been achieved through management transfers, the recommendation there is really around looking from a government perspective at continuing programs around management transfers. I guess some of the feedback from government through this is there's not a lot of appetite around management transfers further at this time, but suggested that potentially the ability to bundle up management transfers with other development opportunities, as we've seen in some other sectors, some other jurisdictions across Australia recently, may also be an opportunity for benefit. So it's one we see, with a long-term view, that the potential for further transfers in future would help again in increasing capacity of the community housing sector and providing that ability to leverage and benefit from those transfers. The sixth recommendation is then, as we touched on earlier, government land is really a key piece in the puzzle in terms of being able to drive supply. And particularly when the sector CHPs look at projects, one of the key constraints there is actually being able to identify and then access appropriate land holdings, particularly where CHPs are competing against private developers on open market. It can be challenging to access land, and particularly land in often the areas where housing is most needed can be the ones that are then hardest to access through the market. And so what we see there is that government, as a significant landholder, can utilise their land as a key tool in unlocking supply. And what we see there is that both lease or sale models can be utilised, and that's really around consideration on a project basis as to the most appropriate structure. But that by bringing land in, that then sort of unlocks the opportunity for other financing sources to come into a project mix and to achieve a lot more out of a project than just government going ahead and delivering housing themselves on that land. So key to see and really beneficial to have seen through the housing diversity pipeline that's proposed through the Smith Street opportunity and through some smaller programs as well where government is making land available for housing. We'd like to see that happening more in terms of a recommendation out of this report. And really the key piece under this was that there doesn't need to be a continued focus on kind of new and innovative project models, that models like the leasehold model at Smith Street, models like grant models that bring in CHP funding as well, are understood, and there needs to be a bit of time for those to be more accepted and more utilised across the sector. And that really the key there is it's not about what's the delivery model, it's about what's the underlying driver of value within that model, which is government land, unlocking those various structures. The final recommendation then is, again, really from a government perspective, is to consider the opportunity to move away from competitive or significantly open tendering processes that can be expensive and lengthy for particularly for CHPs to participate in. So where there are open market processes with expression of interest and then request for proposal and those sorts of structures that require design and legal input and various other due diligence type activities by CHPs, that can be significantly expensive, and for capital constrained organisations, a deterrent to participating in different procurement models. And so that's where we see that there is benefit to not only grant programs, but also more engagement from government around market-led proposals or direct engagement with CHPs for specific opportunities, removing that tendering and competitive tendering process, which can often be a barrier to CHP participation. So that is, in short form, I guess, the summary of the key recommendations that come out of the report. And yeah, I'll hand back to Michelle now, but happy to talk through any of those further as part of the subsequent discussion in this session.